Hello and welcome to First Flight, a Star Trek Enterprise rewatch podcast where we are watching and discussing each episode of Enterprise in succession. First Flight is a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions Network.
This is Commander Tucker of Enterprise. We've got some information you're going to want to hear.
Welcome, Enterprise fans. I am your co-host, Melanie.
And I'm your co-host, Abby.
And tonight we are discussing Acquisition, the 18th episode of Season 1. This episode was written by Maria and Andre Jacques Maton, based on a story by Rick Berman and Brannon Braga. It aired on March 27th, 2002, and was directed by James Whitmore Jr. But before we begin our discussion, we need to issue a read alert.
Tactical alert. All hands to stations.
There are potential spoilers ahead. We might end up talking about any part of the series at any time. But before we go any further, we have an announcement. Tonight, we are very happy to welcome a special guest to the show, our good friend Peter Hong from Twitter at PeterTrek1. Peter is the co-host of the Star Trek Book Club, and we really enjoy talking Trek with him on Twitter and hearing his expertise on Trek trivia, history, novels, and books. Welcome, Peter. How are you doing tonight?
Hello, I'm great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you very much, Abby, for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to talking with you about Enterprise and specifically about Acquisition.
Well, we're really happy to have you here tonight, Peter. And before we get into our discussion, we'd really like to hear your Trek origin story of how did you get into Star Trek, and if you can also tell us your connection with Enterprise.
Sure. Well, I got into Star Trek in high school. When I started high school, I joined the astronomy club because I was interested in astronomy for a few years. And it turned out that everybody in the club were Star Trek fans except for me. And I never really heard of Star Trek before. So in order to participate in the conversations, I ended up starting to watch Star Trek. Turns out at the club, all the club meetings were essentially Star Trek discussions. We didn't really talk much about the actual topic of astronomy. We all talked about Star Trek. So I started to watch TOS, which was the only Star Trek that was around at that time. This was in the early 80s. So I watched TOS in syndication, seen every episode dozens of times. Started reading the novels, started going to conventions, and of course, then continued to get into Star Trek in the 90s during the TNG to Enterprise era. I did a rewatch. I joined Twitter in the spring of 2020 as part of during the pandemic, and then I discovered this whole new area of Star Trek fandom through online. And then right around that same time, I did my first Star Trek rewatch, which was of Enterprise. Seasons 1 and 2 were actually the two seasons in the whole franchise I was sort of maybe least familiar with. I've seen all the episodes. I watched all the different series, but those are the two seasons that I wanted to refresh myself the most at. So I watched the full Enterprise rewatch, and I really developed a greater appreciation of that show after that. So, that's a little bit about my background of Star Trek.
Very cool. I love that astronomy club story.
Yeah.
And I know that Abby and I are also so grateful to have met the Trek Twitter community and met you.
Very much so. And, I've been to a few club meetings that were secretly Star Trek meetings as well. I feel that vibe strongly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And now for a summary of the episode, it's time for Abby's Captain's Log. Okay, Abby, let's go.
Captain Starlog Supplemental.
Okay, Acquisition. A group of thieves knock out the Enterprise crew and begin looting the ship, while a still conscious Trip is the only one who can save them and get rid of the mysterious aliens.
All right, it's time to deploy our subspace transmitters and get into this episode. I'm going to start things off with a question for each of you. What were your initial impressions of the episode? How did you feel about the Ferengi being on the episode? Did you like this one? And you can also wrap your thoughts into the cold open also. Peter, since you're our special guest, why don't you go first?
Okay, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Melanie. Overall, I did enjoy the episode. I think it was one of the more comedic episodes on Enterprise, and it brought in the Ferengi, which we haven't seen in a little while. So I think overall, I enjoyed it. I mean, it's not, while it's not one of my top episodes, when it comes to Enterprise, it was pretty good. I did kind of reminded me of a couple of previous Star Trek episodes, in particular, sort of Starship Mine from TNG. So it has that sort of the die-hard feel of it, especially that first segment with Trip, kind of sneaking around and trying to, understand what's going on. So it had that vibe. And also TNG's Rascals, which was the one in which the Ferengi boarded the Enterprise D for nefarious reasons. And that was the one when Picard and some of the other crew were children. But that aspect of the Ferengi taking over the Enterprise, or at least getting onto the Enterprise, it had a little of that vibe to it. Overall, I did enjoy it. So I think the thing that stood out to me, and we'll maybe go over that towards the end, it was actually the guest stars, because that was, having 3 sort of Trek alumni be part of it was definitely a plus when it comes to this story.
Yeah, that was super cool seeing the Trek alumni. And I hadn't thought of the Die Hard connection. That makes so much sense. Thank you. Abby, how about you? What did you think?
Well, I know that when this episode first came out, I remember in the very early days of internet chat rooms with all this, the supreme backlash about how the crew of the NX-01 saw Ferengi before they were supposed to know, and they were introduced in TNG and all of this. And, I've thought a lot about that in the years since. And I actually, for watching this, went and watched the TNG episode, The Last Outpost, where they were originally introduced. And I know this was a gimmick to get the Ferengi on Enterprise. I don't really care. I liked it. It's a fun episode. Like, yes, it's stretching it a little bit thin that this could have happened and they would never have, in all that time that they were repacking the stuff on the Enterprise, ask them the name of their species or any of that. But I don't really, it's not going to bother me when I watch this. It's not going to take away from my enjoyment. I like this episode, and I like that we saw these as those more early TNG era Ferengi. They have the Ferengi whips, which are always fun. They don't seem very practical, but they're interesting.
Yeah.
They have the costumes that are more like that. They have the mannerisms that are more like that era. They have the same kind of music in the background. If you notice, lots of the like clarinets, but that kind of is more of the spooky clarinet as opposed to the goofy clarinet that they used a lot in TNG when they were using the Ferengi as kind of comedic relief, or even into DS9. And I like those little bits of continuity. And I think that this coming at the end of, the 90s era, the Berman era Trek, whatever you want to call it, they had a lot of Ferengi things to draw on. So to go back and kind of fill in this little gap and show this, it was fun for me. I didn't mind it at all. And I really love that, the entire cold open was done with not a word of English in it. It was all in Ferengi. It was all spoken like that. And you understood quickly what they were doing, what was going on, what everything meant. And that was a nice short cold open. It's hard to get that much story crammed into a little bit. So I'm going to do the magic hand wave that we talk about sometimes with Technobabble and just say, yeah, it's Star Trek. This stuff, we just love it, even though this doesn't make 100% sense if you think about it, and go with just enjoying the episode that way.
Okay, yeah, like the two of you, I also really enjoy this episode, and I did enjoy seeing the Ferengi on the ship, and I love that camera shot that they open with the back of the Ferengi head.
Yes.
I thought that was really cool.
Yes,
And I thought it was pretty clever of them to get around the canon continuity, by never mentioning who they are, revealing who they are. And then at the end, Archer warns them to stay away. And they do stay away for many, many years till the next generation. So I thought it was kind of clever. And I understand that there was a backlash. But for me, I don't care either. I thought it was entertaining, shall we say. Okay, let's talk about the part of the episode where the Ferengi are gathering all the stuff at the beginning. They're still speaking the Ferengi language. They've not woken Archer up yet. They're just gathering a ton of stuff. What were your thoughts on that part, Peter?
Well, I think one thing actually that came up actually is related to the music. I know Abby mentioned a little bit about the music before, but I like what I call sneaking around and hide and seek music that was done throughout the episode. And it was most relevant, I think, or the most obvious here when they were speaking around during gathering things. We were seeing the different parts of the ship. They were inspecting different things they want to take. But in the meantime, in the background, there was that music that was very well done. And I think that, that added to the atmosphere of the show. Throughout the whole show, that was really the main style of music that was done. So that was something that was interesting. And actually, I sort of did a quick check that the composer of the episode was Velton Ray Bunch, and he actually scored about 13 episodes of Enterprise. But he was actually scored a lot of episodes of Quantum Leap. So I think he and Scott Bakula has at least crossed paths before.
Sci-fi takes care of its own.
We're all related. So that was interesting. And but I think going through the different parts of the ship and checking things out, seeing what's available, kind of helps set everything up. And like you said, only Ferengi was spoken during this whole segment. But at the same time, we kind of knew what they were saying without understanding the language through their nonverbal communication, through their faces, how they were handling the different items. So it was still, I think we would still be able to follow along while they were going through the sort of the sneaking phase.
Yeah, I took a note about the music also because I love the music in this part. I thought it was fantastic. And I was hoping you would bring the name of the composer, Peter. I had a feeling you might know that. Thank you. That was really neat. And like you said, you could understand what they were saying, even though we didn't have the translation. So I thought that was interesting. Abby?
All right. So here comes Abby talking about food on Enterprise again. So I adore the part where they're in the mess hall, like going through and smelling stuff and noticing things. And because I happen to notice and freeze frame because now I'm doing that on the food in this show. But when they pull out, it was Mook, when Mook pulls out the plate and it's got crackers and grapes and it's got a big hunk of something in the middle. Well, on freeze frame, you can see it's a beautiful hunk of brie cheese. And that cracked me up because he sniffs it and like tosses it back. And that would personally made me laugh because my younger daughter hates it when I eat brie because she calls it stinky cheese. So I was laughing so hard at that. But I love that Chef must make a mean pecan pie because that's what they end up taking is all the pie. But there was also lemon meringue pie on the table. If you notice, some poor ensigns passed out in it, which is a waste because if Chef is making two kinds of pie in one day, then that's kind of a special day. But I was looking at the food and then it made me think, this gas obviously spread through the ship quickly. And everybody just kind of fell where they were. Thank goodness nobody seems to have knocked their head on like the metal corner of a railing in engineering or, some sort of pipe or everybody kind of landed because I would think, there'd be some bumps and bruises, some head gashes. They tossed Travis out of his chair. Like you hear the thud. So
Aww.
I know. And I'm just sitting here going, well, it's a really good thing everybody fell quite gracefully, or at least not on the corner of anything. So that made me laugh every time after that. I'm watching the people in the background going, all right, who's got the head bump? Because that would have been me. I would have been the one who, passed out and bled to death on the carpet because I hit my head. I really like this whole scene. I like them looking for the different things, not knowing what's valuable and what isn't, being just so Ferengi. And I love that they kept it without any translators, because it really made you focus on the acting more than it would have if they had had the dialogue in English. And that was just fun to watch this guest cast really chew the scenery in this first part.
Yeah, I agree. This guest cast was phenomenal, and I think they were a highlight of this episode. I think it would have been different with different people. So I really enjoyed that. And you're right, I didn't think about that with them getting hurt when they passed out. Good point, Abby. 2 points I thought of in this section were, first of all, it's a good thing Trip is an engineer and that he could get out of decon by using that panel, because if he couldn't do that, that could have become dangerous. So, with him being stuck in there with baking like that, I was psyched that he was able to maneuver his way out of there, but not surprised. And the other thing I thought of was when they are taking the pieces of the ship away and stripping away the chairs and everything, it really got me thinking, you know how the NX-01 is supposed to be less advanced than Kirk's ship, and it's supposed to have that kind of submarine feel. And we've talked about this before, about the gray and the metallics and the metal and the streamlined feeling of that ship, that submarine feel. And when they were yanking Travis's chair out of the floor, and even looking at Archer's chair, it gave me a chance to look at those items more closely than you normally would if they weren't being highlighted. And I think it really did show that those chairs aren't that comfy. And this is kind of basic stuff. And I like seeing the items of the ship highlighted in a way that we hadn't seen them before. I thought that was kind of cool.
Oh, Melanie, I have to say something on that, because I wrote down a note about Travis's chair. It's on a track. Like, I had never noticed until I was rewatching for this. And he has that huge panel in front of him. And when they take the chair, it's got like maybe a 3 or 4 foot track that you can see it rolls back and forth on. That was so interesting for me to notice. And and it hits the door of the turbo lift on the way out. And I just had never put that together before. So I agree. It was so neat seeing that. And I was thinking through this whole thing, man, this was either the prop department's favorite episode of the season because they got to go nuts, or their least favorite episode of the season because they had to go nuts. So I agree. The props in this are fantastic.
There was one thing actually just jogged my memory related to when the crew was fainted or knocked unconscious in the hallway. I noticed that the crew sort of fell on the edges of the hallway at the beginning. So they had enough space for, Trip to run down without jumping. He actually jumps later, but at this phase, he actually does just run straight down. And there was also some room for the Ferengi to kind of like move their carts as they, go around. So I just remember it was kind of funny that nobody fell like cross the block the hallway. So that was appropriate fainting. Convenient. That's right, convenient fainting on the show.
Yeah. Well, that made me think, Peter, I was always wondering now, when it makes sense to me that decon is right next to the shuttle bay or wherever, because it shouldn't be all the way into sick bay before they figure out if they have, some sort of contagion on them. But the fact that it took Trip as long as it did to get from decon to sick bay makes me wonder, okay, so if they did come back with some like horrible microbe that, the gel didn't kill fast enough and they went into shock, would Phlox go into the decon to treat him, or would he walk all the way like Trip ran around in his underwear and to get to sick bay before he treated them? It made me need a map. It was interesting.
I would love to see a map of the NX-01.
I'm going to dig that off the internet at some point later tonight.
There must be some type of technical manual or something. We need that. Okay, so now the Ferengi have woken up Archer. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this initial conversation between Archer and Ulyss. Great scene. What are your thoughts, Peter?
Sure. Well, I really enjoyed the scene with Archer talking and negotiating very quickly with the Ferengi. I think he had it reminded me of some of the classic Ferengi conversations that we saw in DS9 with Quark and with the Grand Nagus, and sort of that style of that back and forth negotiation. And Archer mentioned things like starting with, half of the goal, 15%, 30%, and just threatening to walk away from the deal. So it just brought me flashbacks to some of those classic negotiation conversations that we've heard on DS9. I think Archer did very well. I think he could have probably he handled the Ferengi pretty well. And given that he, haven't met anyone like them before, it's the first time that they've met them. So I think it was one of my favorite parts of the episode was types of sequences that Archer had. So.
Yeah, I agree with you, Peter. Those parts were definitely some of my favorites as well, for sure. Abby?
Well, I have to say, first of all, I appreciate that while Enterprise's favorite feature for me is not that they put people in their underwear, at least they are equal opportunity in having people hang out in their underwear, because Trip is still in his underwear through all of this chunk of this. I have to say, I really enjoyed this scene with Archer being awoken and talking to all the Ferengi. And I really want to call out Jeffrey Combs in this scene and in all of his scenes in this chunk, because he has just played Shran and had some really intense scenes with Archer. And now here he is back. I swear he took lessons from Shran's skeevy Andorian friend, because he's got some ick in there with how he interacts with T'Pol and how he really Ferengifies himself. So bravo to one of the best actors to have graced so many different characters in Star Trek overall. And I really liked this scene. I noticed what I thought was a continuity error, and then realized that it wasn't. When Archer gets hit across the face and his lip starts bleeding, that when you first see it, it's pretty gooey. And then I noticed in my first rewatch, I'm like, wait a minute, all of a sudden it's gone and then it's back. Oh, somebody didn't notice that. But the second time I watched through, I was watching for it. And I saw subtly, you see Archer wipe his mouth and wipe the blood off. And then the next shot, it's not there. And then it's back again, bubbling up again. And I was like, that's actually even better continuity than I thought it was. So bravo to all those little things that I am actually looking for now that somebody obviously looked for then, because that's just really good TV. That's really lovely little details. So I really enjoyed this. I agree with what Peter said. And I also would like to call out the fact that the Ferengi are sniffing boots in people's quarters here. And we know from previous episodes that these boots are made out of recycled human waste. So, that there's a metaphor in there somewhere.
Interesting. Abby, I'm glad you brought up the blood thing, because that is a really neat nuance. And I agree. This portrayal by Jeffrey Combs of Krem was fantastic. I loved his performance here. And I think he really created, for me, a sympathetic character. I felt for Krem. I really did. Yeah. I thought he did a good job with that. And Peter, I'm with you about this negotiations. I love to see the crew improvising together and their teamwork, being able to read each other with this clever bluffing and planning. And Archer does some really great bluffing here. He sizes up the Ferengi quickly. And even though he's getting beat up like he did in the Andorian incident, he still thinks very quickly on his feet to figure out exactly what to say to these guys with the gold bars and the 50%, 20%, 30%, like you said, Peter. And when he says to Ulyss, no deal, I'd rather you take the women and go, Archer was really banking on his instincts, knowing that they wouldn't go for that. Like, that was a really risky bluff, I thought. But Archer felt so confident in his bluff. And also, T'Pol's also misleading them with the scanners and all of that. So I really enjoyed this teamwork by the crew thinking on their feet.
Right. There was also that one scene with right around this time when Archer and Krem went back in to get the next batch, and then Krem was asking about T'Pol. So Archer was kind of sort of criticizing the Vulcan. So that was sort of semi-humorous. That was kind of a little bit funny. I don't think he knew that T'Pol was listening at that time, because I just wasn't sure if because Trip kind of woke her up, but I wasn't sure if Archer knew that. So that was a little bit of a funny quick jog that actually comes back to haunt him, all the way at the end.
Yeah, that was great. I wondered about that too.
Well, and in that scene, we can't forget that that's also when Trip makes the comment of, guy's just here in his underwear and you assume the worst. Like that was just a beautiful little 3-line exchange between T'Pol and Trip. And it shows growth. I mean, they would never have been able to do that or understand that it was not critique, but observation. Just a few episodes ago, I love how the relationship between our big three has grown in just this, 3/4 of this season. It's really nice to see that even in episodes like this, they're showing that growth.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that reminds me of that sickbay fake out scene at the end of Shadows of Pajem, where again, they're reading each other's cues and figuring out how to improvise together. I love this crew. All right, friends. So now we're in the meat of the episode, that middle to end section where Archer, Trip, and T'Pol are all in cahoots together. Archer's trying to sway Krem. Porthos gets involved. Sickbay's involved. Trip and Archer fight together. Peter, what are your thoughts on this stuff?
Lots of different stuff going on at lots of different places. A couple of things jumped to mind, and one of them was in engineering with Archer and with Krem. And this was actually more of a way the shot was composed. This was the one when Archer was continuing to try to convince Krem to help him. And Archer and Krem were in the background of the scene, and in the foreground of the scene was actually a railing or a barrier. But the way that it was shot, they were actually the railing was between Archer and Krem. So there's almost like a boundary between the two of them. So each one is in their own little sort of rectangle. So that was interesting, the way the scene was composed. I wasn't sure if they wanted to say that they were, still apart, or, there was a sort of symbolism from that, or maybe I'm just reading, too deep into that, but that was an interesting component. I mean, this section, there was just a lot of things happening, a lot of everyone kind of doing things together. One thing I wasn't sure was whether they had they talked about what the plan is, because I didn't recall the scene in which they were, saying they're going to do this, they're going to do this, they're going to do this. So, but they were doing it. At least in my head, I thought they had the scene sort of off camera in which they talked about what the plan is, sort of the planning meeting, and then they started to execute it. It was interesting, and it helped move things along to get to the conclusion. The other thing that I wasn't sure about was in T'Pol on the bridge with the scanners, because there were 3 scanners, and she had the distraction with the alarm, and then she took one, but then the other 2 ended up in Ulysses' bag. But I wasn't sure if she put it in there, because I thought Ulysses had it, so I just couldn't tell. I watched it a couple of times to try to figure out how that worked, but that was just a sort of a question that I had that I wasn't sure how that worked. But it was effective, and it started to get the Ferengi to continue to sort of question each other and sort of be suspicious of each other.
Yeah, I love the way that T'Pol got the Ferengi to question one another like that, Peter. And if you look really carefully, you can see that she has this kind of satisfied look on her face.
Oh, yes.
That she has that T'Pol. I'm good. Look, because she's so happy that they're doing that. I loved that. And I really liked the sickbay scene when they were trying to figure out where the vault is. And one thing I did notice was that the writers of this episode are the same writers who wrote Dear Doctor. And I love that they threw in this Menk reference when, when Muke says, "What do you think I am, a Menk?" And it also reminded me that in Dear Doctor, I believe the Valakians did mention that they had an interaction with the Ferengi.
Yep.
And I loved that continuity of the writers putting something in from their previous episode. I really like these writers. They've written some good ones. And like you said, Abby, we see the Ferengi whip again in this part. And gosh, that's a pretty scary weapon. And Euless is a pretty intense guy. I mean, Ethan Phillips does a really good job.
Oh, yes.
Portraying Euless, I thought. How about you, Abby? What are your thoughts?
Well, here's what I'm going to say back to Peter talking about the discussion of the plan that took place off camera.
Mm-hmm.
What I was noticing in this episode is that it feels like I bet it ran long. I bet it took longer to show what they did than they thought it was. Because I also thought, like, when Archer tells Trip when he can't get him unlocked, I've got an idea, but you're going to need some help. And then all of a sudden that he's getting to Paul woken up and all this. I'm guessing that they went through all of this off camera, or maybe that they had more in that scene, because it almost felt like that scene had a really abrupt cutoff. So I'm wondering if they didn't have to cut some of that for time. And I thought the same thing at the end. It just felt like an episode that if it had 5 more minutes, like if it had been on streaming like we have now, it could have been a 50-minute episode instead of a 44.5-minute episode, and it would have made just that little bit of difference in there. But that being said, I loved how it showed them doing some of the things, not just the scanners, but I love watching Trip put that security lock on the door and turning it on so it looked like there was going to be something important back there. That was so nice. And that's that same lock that we see on the door to Daniel's quarters back in Cold Front. And it's so that's a really important moment right there. And I thought that was fun to see. I was wondering about all the produce that ended up on the Ferengi ship when they're moving stuff. Like they must either have a really good like hydroponics or aeroponics bay, or they get a lot of alien produce a lot of places, because it was a huge fruit basket, which is just me being the Enterprise food nerd again. But what I really wanted to talk about was the play acting fight between Trip and Archer. Like that is just so them in a nutshell. Whether or not they had fully prepared that as part of the plan, I don't know. But you could also kind of see them feeling it out with each other. And one of those little details that I noticed again that I loved is when Trip charges Archer and they knock down a whole bunch of those crates and bins and storage containers. You can see both of the guys reaching an arm out, not to hit each other, but to knock over stuff. To make even more of a distraction. And once I noticed that, I was like, oh, geez, they are just so in sync. And it was a beautiful little moment that shows that friendship, and that, again, the unspoken is just as important. And this is where they are growing to as this family on the ship. And I just loved it.
You know, Abby, that is so observant of you and insightful. When I watch this again, I want to look for that, what you said about them planning their fight that way. And I loved that scene too, when Trip again is thinking on his feet. Everyone's coming up with this stuff so quickly about Hoshi being his wife and them playing off each other. That was really great. I hear what you're both saying about the plan being made off camera by the crew and wondering about that. And now I really want to go rewatch that scene you were talking about, Abby, that felt a little abrupt and cut off to you. I think for me, it read as they were purposely keeping us in the dark, out of the loop, and inferring that it was off camera so that we would be surprised and find out what's going on right along with the Ferengi. But I totally see what you mean. One part of this episode, this is the part of the episode, I just have to say this, no matter how many times I watch this episode, every time Porthos gets put in that box, and I know he's going to be okay, but every single time there's no holes in that box for him to breathe.
I know.
It gives me so much anxiety because he's in there for a while. And I just want to say, that bums me out.
I think the same thing every time as well. I'm like, come on, don't latch it close. No, there's not enough air for that puppy. Well, and one last little bit about this part that is not at all important, but makes me smile every time, is when Trip is walking the Ferengi around the ship to kind of get them to the vault, but take a while to do it. I love it that he gets his "keep your shirt on" line that we've heard a few times throughout, because It's just nice. All of us who know it smile, and people who don't know it don't think it sounds out of character. So bravo, writers.
Yeah.
I took a note on that too, Abby. I love that line.
Yeah. There was also that scene around that time when Archer, his facial expressions when Krem was trying to show some initiative to Ulyss. So I noticed he, had a small little nod.
Yes.
He was like a little sense of satisfaction that some of what Archer has been talking to Krem about over the last hour is finally sinking in. But then a few seconds later, when Krem acquiesced to Ulyss, then Archer had this grimace face and said, missed it again.
Yes.
So there was like little subtle facial acting that Scott Bakula had that's amusing to watch while everything was happening.
I noticed that exact same moment. And I also noticed when he was trying to make a deal with Krem and say, well, we can do this and 50-50, and he doesn't take him up on it. And he goes, it's your loss. And I was like, oh, that is disappointed Archer face right there. That's your gift right there.
Yeah, I'm with both of you. I noticed those as well. And I love those facial expressions. Archer's staying in character for Krem throughout the whole thing. And those are some fantastic nuances when he has that disappointed look you were talking about, Peter, and then the encouraging look. And that was great. So let's talk about the finale, the end of the episode where they outsmart the Ferengi. And then we have that great scene at the end on the Ferengi ship. And of course, I forgot, we have T'Pol and her nerve pinch. So this ending part, what are your thoughts, Peter?
Sure. Well, T'Pol with the nerve pinch, it was probably a little bit too long. So I didn't really like that part of it, except for the nerve pinch at the end. I did like her line in which she criticized the humans, saying they were a terrible race, they were deceitful, they were cruel. So this actually kind of circles back to Archer's line from earlier that we talked about. So it was sort of her little way of kind of throwing something back at him, even though he wasn't, really there. But I think that was could have been a little bit shorter and just sort of cut to the nerve pitch. But oh well. I did like, once everything was over and when T'Pol was about to release Archer, and, that's when she was, again, giving him a little bit of a hard time. I actually wanted Archer to say something like, I know he first offered, 5 bars of gold. And then I wanted him to, offer 10, kind of like keep that Ferengi spirit at least a few more minutes longer before she released it. But I think he went back to sort of the Federation mode and just made a captain's decision to orders to get out of those handcuffs. But I think it was a good conclusion and kind of wrap things up well in a comedic way, but sort of keeping in the spirit of this whole episode and the whole story.
Yeah, I thought the scene with him ordering her to undo the handcuffs was pretty funny. That was great. And it shows how comfortable they are together as it's been happening throughout the season.
Yeah, I agree with the whole T'Pol dangling the keys thing. I have to say that she's got some flair with the keys. Like when she first takes them from Krem, she does the little wrist flip. And when she's showing them to Archer, she's dangling them. We've talked in just the past few episodes, especially in Fusion, about how she's a Vulcan where her emotions are closer to the surface. And she's got a sense of humor, a very, very, very dry humor, but it's there. And I think that she is showing the captain that she cares by doing this. And that's a really nice moment. It's definitely light, but it means a lot underneath it. So deep lightness, I guess. But I have to say, the Umax scene, I agree. It's too long. It feels like it goes too far. And I always wonder when she opens up that container and she takes a single weapon, would you not take all 4? Because there were 4 in there. Just take all 4. You don't know when you're going to need another one or when you have opportunity. But I have to say the fact that scene was as long as it was made for at the end when they're on the Ferengi ship and Krem makes one more plea to her that, you could amass a fortune, you'd make a great wife. And she doesn't have to say a thing. She doesn't raise an eyebrow. She doesn't change facial expression. She just turns around and walks away. And that is a mic drop moment. So I will take the uncomfortably long Umach scene to get that walk away because it was absolutely hilarious. And I have to say, the last bit here, I like that the Enterprise crew makes the Ferengi put all the stuff back. It's just the most fitting. It's like, I work with young kids, so you have to say, the consequence should be a natural consequence. If you take something out, you have to put it back. And that's exactly what they got. You took all this time taking it out, now put it all back. And it just seems like for a light episode, that was the right way for it to end. I mean, they could have put him in the brig. They could have taken him back to Starfleet, but they just let them fix the mistake and go away. And I really liked that, because if it had ended differently, it would have changed the whole tone of the episode. And this was a good, light, 75% of the way through the season break that we really needed.
Yeah, I love when they have them put everything back and then they're putting that big, huge, heavy injector or whatever that was, and he drops it on his hand.
Yep.
And they're just following them around under gunpoint. That was awesome. I agree with both of you that the Umach scene was a bit much, but I love that mic drop moment you mentioned, Abby. And I really liked, I don't know if I'm really reading this correctly, if Archer really meant to do this or it just was clever and cute, but I kind of like how Archer stuck up for Krem at the end there, letting Krem have some power there. And I thought that was a really neat way to end it, the way Krem did show his initiative at the end. I really liked that.
It's a very Archer move.
So before we end this section and move into our picks, are there any final thoughts of anything you wanted to share about the episode that you didn't get a chance to? Peter?
Yeah, I think overall, I mean, like I said before, I enjoyed it because of the lightheartedness and the special Star Trek guests that appeared. I think the kind of one thing about the show is that it's really more of a standalone episode. It didn't really link to anything. It didn't connect to anything. So it was more of kind of like its own little adventure. So, and during an incident, Shadows of the Gem, they had story arcs. The Temporal Cold War had their arcs. Even some of the other standalones had kind of a thought or a goal, like Dear Doctor, Shuttle Pod 1. I think those kind of a little bit on the higher rankings. This episode, while it was more comical, so it didn't really have any of those types of themes that you could kind of grab and say, oh, Shuttle Pod 1, that was when, Trip and Malcolm by themselves and, they learned a lot about each other. Or Dear Doctor, flopped and learned something. So here it wasn't really have that, which is fine. I mean, that's, some episodes, I guess we need that once in a while to have that. But that was just one thing I noticed with this particular one.
Yeah, my only thing is not nearly that deep, Peter. I was just thinking about how, again, in this episode, they mention Chef, and we see Chef's handiwork in a bountiful way this episode. And I always wonder if we had seen the actual galley in this episode, not just the mess hall, would we have seen Chef's feet like we do later in the catwalk? I mean, they obviously go out of their way to keep Chef a mystery. But they mention, even stealing Chef because the sandwich is good. So it just makes me smile. It's another one of those little in-jokes for the Enterprise lovers.
Yeah, I love that in-joke about Chef. I really want to see Chef, but I'm glad that they left it that way because that was some good intrigue. My final thoughts are, once again, I just want to highlight the guest cast. I really feel that each actor got the personality traits of their particular Ferengi across, where you could really see where they were coming from. And I thought Clint Howard was really great too, as Muke. Like, he was pretty intense. They were all so good. And lastly, once again, I just want to say how much I love this teamwork of the crew. And even though the Ferengi are portrayed as campy and silly, and we don't really take them seriously that they can really harm us, every time there is that chance of them leaving in a shuttlecraft or taking the women, that's when Trip thought up the Hoshi thing. Like, they prevented any possible serious, our crew was able to prevent any serious consequences every time there was a threat of them leaving or taking the women or whatever. So I love the way our crew worked together.
Yeah, I think any episode that has that, I think it's kind of a winner.
Definitely. Well, that means we've arrived at our Porthos pick, which is our favorite part of the episode. Peter, what's your favorite part?
My favorite part is actually the literal Porthos pick when Muke and Grish was asking Porthos where the gold was, and then Muke picked them up. So it was just, I got a good chuckle out of that scene. In the beginning, they were expecting to have him answer before they realized, that she wouldn't be able to answer. So that was funny and a favorite part of mine.
I love that part. I love when they say, look at the size of its ears. And when they're asking Porthos, where's the vault? My translator won't lock on to its language. I absolutely love that part also.
I love, Peter, that you literally picked a Porthos pick. That is so perfect. My Porthos pick for the night is the Ferengi costumes. They were amazing. We were talking about how the guest cast made all of their characters come alive because of their acting. Well, the costumes did the same thing. They were all very Ferengi, but very individual as well. And they had so many good details. And like I said before, I had watched the last output, the TNG episode, where the next time we see them in the timeline, you could see the connections there, but you could also see the growth for where it goes to DS9. And it was just, we even saw their striped socks close up. It was so neat to see the different fabrics, the colors, the patterns, the embellishments. They were gorgeous. So bravo to those Ferengi costumes this time.
Yeah, those were spectacular, really detailed, really amazing. I agree.
And also related to the costumes, in the beginning when I was watching it, I was getting a little confused as to, the different Ferengi. So I ended up using the colors and the costumes that they were wearing as a way to identify how each one in each of the different scenes. So I used it and that was very helpful to have. So that was a great pick to have there.
My pick, I actually thought of Porthos as well, Peter.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm so glad you chose it. I loved the scene with Porthos in Archer's quarters. And of course, the scene at the end when he gets him out of the box is so adorable when he says, "Oh, Porthos." That was so cute. So I'm going to choose my other Porthos pick because I had another thing that I loved, which is after Krem is touching T'Pol's ear and drooling over T'Pol, when she stands up and says, "There are times I wish Vulcans hadn't learned to repress their violent tendencies." I love that line.
I wonder if I wasn't channeling this episode back in Fusion where I was wishing she had let her violent tendencies out. So yes, that is a perfect T'Pol moment in there.
Accessing library computer data.
Well, it's time to share some trivia. Peter, what can you tell us about acquisition?
I do have actually a couple of little tidbits of trivia for this episode. The first actually is related to Trip. Instead of his usual red engineering uniform that he wears, in this episode, he wore a blue science uniform. Also, in a later episode, he's going to be wearing a gold captain's uniform in Twilight. So that means that he is the only crew member on Enterprise that wears the uniforms of all three divisions at least once on the show. So that I found that to be interesting.
That's cool.
And then the second trivia I have is related to one of the guest stars, to Clint Howard. He's the one who plays Muke. This was his third of 4 guest appearances on the Star Trek franchise. He actually started Star Trek with TOS as he was playing Baylock in the Corbomite Maneuver. Then he was on DS9 as Grady in Past Tense. This is his third episode in Enterprise. And then he was most recently in Discovery in the season 1 finale, Will You Take My Hand, when he played Orion. So between his first appearance on TOS and his most recent one on Discovery, it was actually about 51 years between that time period. So he's an alumni of Star Trek a few times over.
That's amazing. He was so great in Corbomite Maneuver. What a long, long career. He is Ron Howard's brother, correct?
Yes, he is Ron Howard's brother. He also had a acting career that has a lot of different credits. I actually remember him in Apollo 13 right around the mid 90s when he was one of the members of the controlling team in NASA. So that was interesting.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Very cool. Abby, what do you have?
So I have a nice short and sweet one here, but you'll never unsee it once you see it. The Ferengi pad that's used in DS9 over and over and over again, most notably in Quark's bar, is used here in Enterprise as a Ferengi scanner, but all they really did was add a couple LED lights.
Very interesting. I have two tonight also. The first one is, because this is an earlier time frame, there are only 173 rules of acquisition in this episode. But by the 24th century, there are 285 rules of acquisition. So I thought that was interesting. And lastly, once again, the writers of this episode, Maria and Andre Jacques Maton, they are the ones who came up with this Ferengi language. It was created specifically for this episode, and they based it on the French language. And I thought that was very interesting.
That is really interesting because as much time as we spent listening to just the Ferengi language in this episode, I noticed that it didn't sound like any of the other languages in Trek that we've heard before. So interesting to know that it was based off of French, and that's probably why.
Yeah, and I think that gives another kudos to the 4 guest stars who were playing the Ferengi in this episode, because they had to learn or be able to speak a language that really didn't exist. So they have these lines and these phonics and inflections that
yes,
that is just made up for this episode, but they were able to do it for a long time, for relative the 10-15 minutes at the beginning of the episode. That's another great job they did there.
Absolutely.
Transfer of data is complete.
Well, we've arrived at our Vulcan's verdict. On a scale of 1 to 10 grapplers, how are you rating acquisition, Peter?
Well, I rate the episode 6 out of 10. Best part were the strong guest stars that were in this episode. But I also felt that because it really wasn't sort of anything substantial or permanent that happened at the end, there wasn't a payoff. So that was the reason why I had that rating.
Okay, we have a 6 on the table. How about Abby?
Well, this episode was kind of silly, over the top fun. But again, like I said at the beginning, I don't mind it. I don't mind the hand waving, the conceit. The Ferengi were well done. Everyone chews the scenery and does big performances, and they obviously enjoyed themselves doing it. Plus the great guest stars. I think that in this part of the season where we're at, this one really stands out as kind of a breath of fresh air. So 7.5 of 10 grapplers for me.
Yeah, I'm with you guys. Is it campy? Yes. Is it silly? Yes. Is it fun? Definitely for me. I find it pretty highly entertaining. So I ended up giving it a 7.5 grapplers. We want to thank our friend Peter Hong. Peter, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was so much fun and so wonderful to chat with you and to talk about Enterprise and acquisition. Thank you for being here. And why don't you let our listeners know again how to find you on social media?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank you, Melanie and Abby, for having me. I really enjoyed talking about Enterprise and about this episode. I'm honored to be asked to be on your show. So thank you very much. The best way to reach me is on Twitter. My handle is at PeterTrek1, the number 1. So feel free to connect with me over there, and we could chat about all things Trek. I also like to give a quick plug for the Trek Book Club on Twitter. Over there, we read Star Trek novels, and we discuss one over every month and a half over a weekend. Twitter. So if you're interested, just check out the Twitter handle, which is at Trek Book Club. So thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it was our pleasure. We loved having you here. And thank you for mentioning the Trek Book Club. Definitely check that out, people. And Peter is a great follow on Twitter. And if you'd like to continue the discussion with us, you can reach us at First Flight Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And Abby, what's the best way to reach you?
Best way to find me is on Twitter. I'm at Abby M. Summer. That's SOMMER.
We want to thank you all for spending this time with us, and we'll be back next time with Oasis, the 19th episode of Season 1. And as always, we leave you with this quote from Captain Jonathan Archer. The most profound discoveries are not necessarily beyond that next star. They're within us, woven into the threads that bind us, all of us, to each other.